Rejected for the job of her dreams, Renee Jackson was told she didn't belong. But what happened next stunned the entire corporate world. The black woman who wasn't right for the role would soon become the CEO of the very company that turned her away, proving that resilience and vision could shatter even the highest glass ceilings. This is the story of how she transformed rejection into an unstoppable legacy. All right, before we dive into this epic story, quick question. Are you all about sunny summer vibes or cozy winter feels? Drop your favorite season in the comments below. Renee Jackson had always known the cards were stacked against her. Growing up in the south side of Chicago, she had watched her mother, Linda, work tirelessly to support her family. Linda Jackson had been a single mother who juggled multiple jobs while making sure her children understood the importance of education. From a young age, Renee learned what it meant to work hard and face adversity head-on. "You can be anything you want to be," her mother often told her, "but you'll have to fight for it." And fight Renee did. Academics came naturally to her, and she was determined to go far. She graduated top of her high school class, earning a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she majored in business management. She excelled, not just in her studies but also in leadership roles, standing out for her sharp mind and relentless drive. But despite her qualifications, Renee knew the realities she would face. As a black woman, she would have to work twice as hard to prove herself in corporate America, a world dominated by white men. Still, she was ready to take on the challenge. After earning her MBA, Renee worked her way through several mid-level roles, gaining experience in business strategy, leadership, and consulting. Each position taught her more about the inner workings of corporate America and the barriers women like her faced. The invisible walls, the glass ceilings, became all too clear, but Renee was undeterred. She had a goal, and no matter how many times the world tried to box her in, she pushed forward. At 35, she set her sights on a senior leadership position at TechCore, a major tech company renowned for its cutting-edge innovations, but criticized for its lack of diversity at the top. TechCore was looking for a new senior vice president of business strategy, and Renee knew she was perfect for the role. She prepared meticulously, crafting a pitch that showcased her vision for the company's future and how she could lead it into a new era of growth. This was her moment. When the call came inviting her for an interview, Renee felt a rush of excitement mixed with nerves. This was the opportunity she had been working toward for years. She walked into the interview confident, ready to show the panel of executives what she could offer. The interview was grueling, as expected, with tough questions about her leadership style and experience. But Renee handled each question with precision, showcasing her deep knowledge of business strategy and her commitment to creating an inclusive, innovative corporate culture. However, as the interview progressed, Renee sensed something familiar in the room, a quiet skepticism, the unspoken judgments lingering just beneath the surface. She could feel it in the way the interviewers exchanged quick glances and the tone of their questions that seemed to subtly undermine her experience. Despite her qualifications, they weren't seeing her for what she truly was, a leader. Instead, they were seeing a black woman who didn't quite fit their image of a senior executive. A few weeks later, her suspicions were confirmed. An email from TechCore arrived, short and impersonal. "We regret to inform you." Renee didn't need to read the rest. She had been passed over again. Despite everything she had done to prepare, despite her qualifications, she wasn't what they wanted. They hadn't even bothered to offer constructive feedback, just a vague rejection and a polite wish for her future endeavors. Renee was devastated. She had faced rejection before, but this time it stung more than usual. She knew she was the best candidate for the job. She had poured everything into that interview, and it hadn't been enough. Her identity had overshadowed her qualifications once again. For a moment, the weight of it all seemed unbearable. The years of fighting to prove herself, of pushing against the invisible barriers that held women like her back. But then something shifted. The frustration, the anger, and the disappointment didn't break her. They fueled her. Sitting alone in her apartment that night, Renee made a decision. She wasn't going to let this defeat define her. She had been fighting for too long to give up now. If TechCore didn't see her worth, then she would make sure the rest of the world did. And she wouldn't stop until she built something even greater than what they had refused her. The next morning, Renee woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sting of TechCore's rejection was still there, but instead of feeling defeated, she felt empowered. If they didn't see her value, she would create her own path. This wasn't the first time she'd been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But every setback had only made her stronger, more determined to succeed on her own terms. With a cup of coffee in hand, Renee sat down at her desk and opened her well-worn notebook, the one she had carried with her since her days in business school. It was filled with scribbled ideas, plans for businesses, and leadership strategies she had dreamt of executing one day. As she flipped through its pages, she began to outline her next move. She would start her own consulting firm, one that specialized in business strategy, leadership development, and corporate diversity. It would be more than just a business. It would be a movement, one that would help companies thrive by embracing diversity and inclusion as core values. Renee had seen firsthand the stagnation that occurred when companies failed to innovate, to bring in fresh perspectives. She knew that her approach could help companies not only survive, but thrive in a rapidly changing business world. The decision wasn't made lightly. Renee knew the challenges she would face, especially as a Black woman entrepreneur. The statistics were grim. Black women-owned businesses often struggled to secure funding, gain clients, and build credibility in industries dominated by white men. But Renee was used to being an outlier, and the odds had never stopped her before. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly to develop her business plan. Jackson's Strategic Solutions was born. She spent hours researching the industry, identifying potential clients, and figuring out how to differentiate herself in a crowded market. She reached out to her network, including her old colleagues and mentors, to gauge interest and seek advice. But more than that, she reached out to Denise Walker, a mentor who had guided her through many of the early stages of her career. Denise had always been a steady voice in Renee's life, someone who had experienced many of the same challenges as a Black woman in corporate America. She had faced her share of barriers, but she had also learned how to overcome them, making her an invaluable source of wisdom. "Denise, I don't know if I'm ready for this," Renee confessed one evening over the phone. "Starting my own firm feels like jumping off a cliff without knowing what's at the bottom." Denise chuckled, her voice warm and reassuring. "Renee, you've been preparing for this your entire life. You've already overcome challenges that would have broken most people. Trust yourself. You've got the skills, the vision, and the drive. This is your moment." Renee took those words to heart. The fear of failure was real, but it wasn't going to stop her. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge, and this would be no different. As she prepared to launch her firm, Renee continued to build her brand. She began speaking at industry events, writing articles on leadership, and networking tirelessly to gain visibility. The work was exhausting, but it paid off. Within months, Renee had landed her first client, a mid-sized tech company that had been struggling with leadership issues and wanted to revamp its corporate structure. It wasn't TechCore, but it was a start. As her firm gained traction, word of mouth began to spread. Jackson's Strategic Solutions became known for its no-nonsense approach to leadership development and its focus on creating inclusive workplace cultures. Renee's background in strategy consulting, combined with her unique perspective as a Black woman in leadership, resonated with companies that were serious about change. Slowly but surely, her client base grew. But even as she experienced these early victories, the shadow of TechCore loomed large in Renee's mind. She couldn't forget the sting of that rejection, and the knowledge that they had dismissed her still weighed heavily. But she had moved on. At least that's what she told herself. Then one evening, as she was working late on a proposal, Renee received a call that would change everything. It was from an old contact, someone she hadn't spoken to in years. TechCore was in trouble. The company was reeling from a scandal. Allegations of workplace discrimination, a toxic culture, and plummeting profits had left its leadership team scrambling. Their CEO was stepping down in disgrace, and they were desperate to find someone to clean up the mess and restore the company's reputation. Renee's heart raced as she listened to the details. They needed new leadership. And now, after all this time, TechCore was considering her for the position of CEO. For a moment, she couldn't believe it. The company that had once rejected her was now coming to her for help. They were looking for someone who could turn the ship around, who could rebuild trust and restore order after years of mismanagement. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for. But this time, Renee wasn't the same woman she had been when she first applied for a job at TechCore. She had grown, evolved, and proven herself as a leader in her own right. Now, she wasn't just interviewing for a position. She was negotiating from a place of power. She had built something of her own, and she wasn't going to walk into TechCore without a plan. If they wanted her leadership, they would have to meet her on her terms. The road to this moment had been long and difficult, but Renee was ready. This time, she wasn't asking for permission to lead. She was demanding it. Renee Jackson had never been one to shy away from a challenge, but as she launched her business and began the grueling process of building her brand from the ground up, she quickly realized that the corporate world wasn't going to make it easy for her. Jackson's Strategic Solutions was still in its infancy, and despite the small victories she had experienced, she knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The obstacles started almost immediately. As soon as her firm began gaining attention, Renee encountered the kind of challenges she had anticipated, but the reality of those challenges hit harder than she expected. Despite her credentials, her proven track record, and the quality of her work, there were still whispers in the industry, doubts that seemed to follow her every move. Is she really qualified? Is this just a diversity play? Can she handle the big projects? These were the same doubts that had haunted her throughout her career, and now they were casting a shadow over her new venture. Renee knew what was really happening. The corporate world wasn't used to seeing someone like her, a black woman, standing at the helm of a consulting firm focused on executive leadership. They weren't used to her confidence, her boldness, or her unapologetic approach to addressing the elephant in the room: corporate America's deep-seated issues with race and gender. It wasn't just about her qualifications, it was about their inability to see past her identity. But Renee didn't back down. She had learned a long time ago that the only way to change the narrative was to keep pushing forward, no matter how many people doubted her. She wasn't going to let their narrow-mindedness stop her. If anything, it made her more determined to succeed. Every time she heard the doubts or felt the skepticism in a potential client's voice, she reminded herself of the reason she started this journey: to break the barriers that had held so many like her back for so long. Her days were long, filled with meetings, presentations, and late-night brainstorming sessions. Her phone never stopped buzzing with emails from potential clients, invitations to speak at industry events, and requests for proposals. Each day she fought tooth and nail to prove herself, to show that her company wasn't just another diversity initiative or a token hire, but a powerhouse of expertise and innovation. However, the pressure was relentless. Renee found herself juggling more than just her business. As one of the few black women running her own consulting firm in the industry, she constantly felt like she was carrying the weight of an entire community on her shoulders. It wasn't just about her success, it was about setting an example, about proving that Black women could thrive in spaces that had historically excluded them. And yet, there were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the office was quiet and the weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her, Renee sometimes wondered if she had taken on too much. She was fighting battles on multiple fronts, against systemic racism, against gender bias, against the old boys club that still dominated the corporate world. Was she strong enough to keep going? Could she really make the kind of impact she had set out to make? Those doubts crept in during the quiet moments, but they never stayed for long. Every time Renee questioned herself, she thought back to all the women who had come before her, women like her mother, who had faced impossible odds and still managed to succeed. Giving up wasn't an option. She owed it to herself, to her family, and to every Black woman who had been told she wasn't good enough, that she couldn't make it to the top. She had to keep fighting. It wasn't long before her tenacity began to pay off. Renee started getting noticed for her bold approach to leadership development and diversity consulting. Her clients began to see real results: improved morale, better team cohesion, increased innovation, all because of the changes she helped them implement. Word spread quickly, and soon she found herself landing bigger and bigger clients. Major companies that had previously ignored her were now reaching out, eager to work with her and her team. But with success came more scrutiny. As her firm grew, so did the expectations placed on her. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have an opinion about how she should run her business. Some clients wanted her to soften her approach, to focus less on diversity and more on profits. Others questioned her decisions, suggesting that she stick to what she knew and leave the complex leadership strategies to the experts, even though she was the expert. It was clear to Renee that many people still didn't take her seriously. They wanted the appearance of diversity without the commitment to change. They wanted her to help them check a box, to put a pretty face on their otherwise stagnant corporate cultures. But Renee wasn't interested in playing along. She hadn't started this company just to be a figurehead or a token. She was here to make real, lasting changes in the way companies thought about leadership, strategy, and inclusion. One of the toughest moments came when a potential client, a large financial firm, asked her to tone down her messaging. They were interested in hiring her firm, but only if she agreed to downplay the emphasis on diversity and inclusion in her proposals. "We love your ideas, but the diversity piece might be too much for some of our senior executives. They're not ready for that kind of shift in thinking," the client explained, his voice dripping with condescension. Renee felt a familiar pang of frustration rise up inside her. This was exactly the problem. The very people who needed to embrace change were the ones resisting it, the ones who didn't want to confront the reality of their own biases. And now, they were asking her to compromise her values, to water down her vision, just to make them feel more comfortable. She took a deep breath before responding. "I appreciate your interest," she said, her voice steady but firm. "But if you're not ready to address diversity and inclusion in a meaningful way, then my firm isn't the right fit for you." The client seemed taken aback, clearly not expecting Renee to stand her ground. "But this is a huge opportunity for you. Are you sure you want to pass this up?" Renee didn't hesitate. "I'm sure. My goal isn't just to make money, it's to make a difference, and if your company isn't ready for that, then I'll find someone who is." With that, the conversation ended. Renee had walked away from what could have been a lucrative contract, but she felt a sense of pride. She had stayed true to her mission, and she wasn't about to compromise her values for anyone, not even for the promise of financial success. Her integrity was non-negotiable. As the months went on, Renee's firm continued to grow. She brought on a small team of consultants, most of whom were women of color like herself. Together, they built a reputation for being unapologetically focused on driving real change within companies. They didn't just talk about diversity and inclusion. They implemented it, pushed for it, fought for it, and made sure it became a core part of every company's DNA. The clients who did choose to work with her firm were the ones who truly wanted to evolve, who understood that diversity wasn't just a buzzword. It was the key to innovation and success. These clients saw the results, and they began recommending Jackson's strategic solutions to other businesses, expanding Renee's reach and influence in the corporate world. But even as her business thrived, TechCore remained in the back of her mind. The rejection still lingered, not because it had hurt her ego, but because she knew that TechCore represented everything wrong with corporate America. They were the epitome of the problem. A company that wanted to be seen as innovative and forward-thinking, but that still clung to outdated ideas about who should hold positions of power. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing a proposal, she received a call that stopped her in her tracks. It was from an executive recruiter, someone she had worked with early in her career. TechCore was looking for new leadership. Their current CEO was stepping down amidst scandal, and the company was scrambling to find someone who could restore their reputation and guide them through a difficult transition. Renee could hardly believe it. After all this time, the company that had once rejected her was now in need of someone exactly like her, someone who could bring fresh ideas, someone who understood the challenges of building an inclusive, forward-thinking company, someone who could do what they had been failing to do for years. The recruiter explained that TechCore's board of directors was looking for candidates with proven leadership experience, a strong track record of success, and an ability to navigate the complexities of corporate transformation. It was a tall order, but it was a role that Renee knew she was uniquely qualified for. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same company that had once dismissed her was now coming to her for help. She had built a successful business, earned the respect of industry leaders, and proven that her ideas weren't just valid, they were necessary. And now, TechCore needed her. As she ended the call, Renee sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was her moment. She had spent years building her reputation, proving herself over and over again, and now she had the chance to do something truly transformative. She had the chance to become the CEO of the very company that had once told her she wasn't the right fit. But this time, things were going to be different. She wasn't walking into TechCore as someone looking for approval. She was walking in as the leader they needed. Renee stared at the phone long after the call had ended, her mind buzzing with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. TechCore, the very company that had rejected her, the company that hadn't seen her value, was now in crisis, and they were looking for someone like her to clean up their mess. The irony was almost too sweet to bear, but this wasn't just about irony, or even about vindication. This was about something much bigger. This was Renee's opportunity to change the game. The invitation from the executive recruiter played over and over in her mind. TechCore needed new leadership, someone to step in and turn things around after the scandal that had rocked the company. The details were still unfolding, but from what Renee had gathered, TechCore's problems ran deep. Allegations of workplace discrimination, a toxic work environment, and poor leadership at the top had left the company reeling. Their CEO, once lauded for his business acumen, was stepping down in disgrace, and the board was scrambling to find someone who could restore the company's image and lead it into the future. And now they wanted her to interview for that position. Renee had always known that she was capable of leading a company like TechCore. Her consulting firm had given her the chance to prove, not just to others but to herself, that she had what it took to succeed at the highest levels of corporate leadership. But now that the opportunity was in front of her, the stakes felt higher than ever. This wasn't just about taking over a company. It was about stepping into the lion's den, confronting the very culture that had dismissed her years ago, and proving once and for all that she was more than capable of leading it. The night after the call, Renee sat at her desk, the recruiter's voice still echoing in her head. Could she really do this? Could she step into TechCore and fix what had been broken? The challenges would be immense. The company was a mess, and the problems went far beyond the scandal that had made headlines. From what she had learned, the leadership team was fractured, morale was low, and the company's reputation had taken a severe hit. But wasn't this exactly what she had been preparing for all along? The opportunity to step into a leadership role, to take on a challenge that no one else wanted to touch, and to prove, once and for all, that her way of doing business wasn't just the right way, it was the future. Renee knew she had to think carefully. This wasn't just about accepting an offer. This was about strategy. She would be walking into an environment that had already shown her years earlier that it wasn't ready for someone like her. And now, in the wake of the scandal, the same forces that had rejected her were desperate. Desperate companies didn't always make the best decisions, and if she wasn't careful, she could end up being used as a scapegoat rather than a solution. She wasn't about to let that happen. Over the next few days, Renee prepared herself for what would likely be the most important interview of her life. This time, she wasn't walking into TechCore with the same wide-eyed optimism she had carried during her first interview. She knew better now. She understood the realities of corporate politics, of the hidden agendas and biases that could sabotage even the most qualified candidates. But she also knew her worth. She knew what she brought to the table, and this time she was going to make sure they saw it too. Renee began her preparations the way she always did, with research. She dove into everything she could find about TechCore's current situation, analyzing their financials, reviewing the public statements made by their leadership, and gathering as much information as she could about the culture that had led to the company's downfall. She wanted to walk into the interview armed with more than just a vision. She wanted to come with solutions. Next, she turned her attention to the board of directors. If she was going to take over as CEO, she needed to understand who she would be working with. The board held the power, and she knew that if she wanted to succeed, she had to convince them that she was the right person for the job. Through her network, Renee gathered as much information as she could about the board members, their professional backgrounds, their leadership styles, and their potential biases. She wasn't going to leave anything to chance. The day of the interview arrived faster than she expected. Renee stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, smoothing down the jacket of her tailored suit. She was ready. This time, she wasn't walking into the interview room as a candidate hoping to be chosen. She was walking in as a leader who knew her value. The difference was palpable. The nervous energy that had accompanied her first interview with TechCore was gone, replaced by a quiet, confident resolve. This was her time. As she entered the sleek, modern offices of TechCore once again, the memories of her previous rejection flickered briefly in her mind. The lobby, with its pristine marble floors and glass walls, looked the same, but Renee knew that everything had changed. She wasn't the same woman she had been years ago. She had grown. She had built a business, earned the respect of her peers, and proven herself in ways that went far beyond any corporate title. The boardroom was spacious and intimidating, with a long, polished table at its center and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. The board members, 7 in total, were already seated, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism as she entered the room. She recognized most of them from her previous interview, faces that had once dismissed her with polite smiles and empty words. But today, their expressions were more guarded, their postures tense. Renee's eyes met theirs one by one as she took her seat at the head of the table. This was different. She wasn't here to prove that she belonged. She was here to show them that they needed her, and she could sense that they knew it too. The chairman of the board, a gray-haired man with a steely gaze, started the meeting with formalities, but it wasn't long before the questions began. They asked her about her vision for TechCore, how she would handle the scandal that had rocked the company, and what her strategy would be for turning around the toxic culture that had driven so many employees to leave. The questions were tough, but Renee was ready. She had spent weeks preparing for this, and every word that came out of her mouth was measured, confident, and backed up by years of experience. But there was one moment in the interview that stood out to Renee, a moment that reminded her of just how far she had come. As the conversation shifted to leadership, one of the board members, a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, leaned forward, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You talk a lot about diversity and inclusion," he said, his tone polite but skeptical. "But we need someone who can focus on the bottom line. Do you think that prioritizing diversity might be a distraction from the bigger issues we're facing?" The question hung in the air for a moment, but Renee didn't flinch. She had heard this kind of question before. It was a common refrain from people who didn't understand the power of diversity, or who didn't want to. With calm certainty, she met his gaze and replied, "Diversity and inclusion aren't distractions. They're the solution. Your company is failing because you've been ignoring the voices that could have helped you succeed. You've overlooked talent, and as a result, you've stagnated. Bringing in diverse perspectives isn't just about checking a box. It's about driving innovation, fostering creativity, and making better decisions. If you want this company to thrive, you need to embrace that." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over the table. She could see the shift in the board members' expressions, a mixture of surprise and something else. Respect. For the first time, she felt like they were really listening to her, not as a token diversity candidate, but as a leader who could transform their company. The rest of the interview went smoothly, and by the time it ended, Renee felt a sense of accomplishment. She had walked into that boardroom and delivered exactly what she had promised: a vision, a plan, and the confidence to lead. As she shook hands with the chairman and made her way out of the office, she felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. She had done everything she could. Now, all she had to do was wait. The next week passed in a blur. Renee threw herself back into her work at Renee Jackson Strategic Solutions, meeting with clients, finalizing proposals, and continuing to push her business forward. But even as she worked, the possibility of becoming TechCore's new CEO lingered in the back of her mind. Then, one morning, the call came. Renee was in her office reviewing a client report when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Her heart raced as she answered. It was the chairman of TechCore's board. "Renee," he said, his voice calm but serious. "The board has made a decision. We'd like to offer you the position of CEO." This was it. This was the moment she had worked for, fought for. The rejection, the struggles, the sleepless nights, they had all led to this. She had done it. "I'm honored," Renee finally replied, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. "I accept." As she hung up the phone, Renee allowed herself a moment to breathe, to take it all in. She had become the CEO of TechCore, the very company that had once turned her away. But this was just the beginning. The real work was about to start. As the new CEO of TechCore, Renee Jackson knew the weight of her responsibility, and it was heavier than she had ever imagined. Becoming the leader of a major corporation, especially one as high-profile as TechCore, was no small feat. But as she stepped into her new role, the enormity of what lay ahead started to sink in. The celebration of her appointment was short-lived. Now, the real battle began. From the moment her new position was announced, the media was buzzing with stories of the company's dramatic turnaround. Headlines lauded her as the new face of TechCore, a groundbreaking figure who was expected to clean up the company's internal mess and restore its damaged reputation. But with that attention came scrutiny. Intense, unrelenting scrutiny. Critics emerged almost immediately. Some claimed her appointment was nothing more than a PR move by the board to save face after the scandals that had rocked the company. They questioned whether she had been chosen for her qualifications or merely for the optics of diversity. These whispers weren't new to Renee, but now they were louder than ever, amplified by the media and her growing visibility. In the first few weeks of her tenure, Renee was greeted with polite smiles from her senior leadership team, but she could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't going to be easy. She was taking over a company that had been led, for decades, by men who were comfortable in their positions of power. The shift from the previous CEO, a man who had left amidst allegations of misconduct and mismanagement, was a hard one for many in the company to accept. And now they had a black woman at the helm, something that had likely never even crossed their minds as a possibility. As Renee navigated her new role, it became clear that not everyone was on board with the changes she wanted to make. Some members of the executive team were resistant, clinging to the old ways of doing business. They had been part of TechCore's leadership for years, entrenched in their positions, and they weren't eager to see someone like Renee come in and start shaking things up. She could feel their skepticism in meetings, see it in the way they questioned her decisions or subtly undermined her authority. It was a classic power struggle, one that she had anticipated but was still exhausting to face every day. Renee had known going into this role that she would face internal resistance. Change is uncomfortable, especially for those who had grown used to the status quo. And yet, she hadn't expected the level of passive-aggressive pushback she was receiving from some of her senior executives. Meetings were often filled with tension, as certain members of her team found subtle ways to challenge her authority, questioning her strategies, second-guessing her decisions, or attempting to bypass her altogether by going directly to the board with concerns. One of the most notable instances of this came during a meeting about restructuring the company's leadership. Renee had been clear from the beginning that one of her top priorities was to build a more inclusive and dynamic leadership team. She had spent weeks analyzing the company's current structure, identifying gaps, and outlining a plan for promoting more diverse talent from within the company. But when she presented her proposal to the senior leadership team, she was met with thinly veiled resistance. "I'm just not sure if this is the right time for such a drastic shift," one executive said, his voice measured but with an underlying note of condescension. "We've already had a lot of upheaval lately. Maybe we should focus on stability for now, rather than making big changes to the leadership team." Renee kept her expression neutral, though inside she was seething. This was the same executive who had been part of the previous CEO's inner circle, and she knew exactly what he was trying to do: delay, undermine, and ultimately preserve his own power. But she wasn't going to let that happen. "I understand your concerns," Renee replied calmly. "But stability doesn't come from maintaining a broken system. It comes from evolving. If we don't take steps to address the leadership gaps now, we'll continue to see the same problems that have plagued this company for years. This isn't about drastic change for the sake of change. It's about creating a team that reflects the future of this company, not its past." The tension in the room was palpable, but Renee didn't back down. She had fought too hard to get to this point, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially those clinging to outdated ideas, derail her vision for TechCore. The executive didn't argue further, but she knew she hadn't won him over. He, and others like him, would be watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. It wasn't just internal conflicts that Renee had to navigate. Externally, the pressure was just as intense. The media coverage of her appointment as CEO had brought both praise and criticism. Many celebrated her as a trailblazer, a woman of color breaking barriers in the tech industry. But others were quick to question whether she had the chops to lead such a large and troubled company. The scrutiny was unrelenting. Articles dissected her every decision. Commentators on business networks debated whether she was the right choice to lead TechCore, and her inbox was flooded with unsolicited advice from every corner of the industry. Everyone had an opinion about how she should run the company, and most of them were thinly veiled criticisms of her leadership style or her focus on diversity. One particularly brutal article, published in a leading business magazine, called into question her ability to focus on the real issues facing TechCore. Renee Jackson has made diversity and inclusion the cornerstone of her leadership strategy. The article read, "But in a company facing financial difficulties, one has to wonder if this is the right time for such a focus. Shouldn't profitability and growth be the priority?" Renee knew exactly what the article was implying, that she was too focused on inclusion and not enough on the bottom line. It was an argument she had heard before, from people who didn't understand that diversity wasn't a distraction from business success. It was integral to it. But convincing people of that, especially those who had benefited from the status quo, was going to be an uphill battle. Even as these external pressures mounted, Renee found herself struggling with an internal conflict as well. Could she really do this? Could she lead this company in the face of so much resistance, both inside and outside the boardroom? There were moments when the weight of it all felt like too much. Moments when she questioned whether she had made the right decision by accepting this role. The doubts crept in late at night, when the office was quiet and she was left alone with her thoughts. Was she in over her head? Had she bitten off more than she could chew? But those moments of doubt never lasted long. Renee had spent her entire life overcoming obstacles, facing down challenges that would have broken others. She had been told countless times that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't qualified, that she didn't belong, that she couldn't succeed in a world that wasn't made for her. And yet she had proven them wrong, time and time again. This was no different. Renee reminded herself of why she had taken this job in the first place. It wasn't just for herself. It was for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, everyone who had been passed over or rejected because of their identity. This was bigger than her. She had the chance to make real change, not just at TechCore, but in the industry as a whole. She couldn't afford to let doubt or fear hold her back. She had come too far for that. Her mentor, Denise, had once told her, "The higher you climb, the more resistance you'll face, but the view from the top is worth it." Those words echoed in her mind now, as she prepared herself for the next phase of her journey. She knew the resistance would continue, both from within the company and from the outside world. But she also knew that she was ready for it. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. In the following weeks, Renee began to implement her vision for TechCore with a renewed sense of purpose. She held one-on-one meetings with each member of her leadership team, making it clear that she expected their full support in executing her strategies. She spent time on the ground, meeting with employees at every level of the company, listening to their concerns, and gaining their trust. She held town hall meetings where she laid out her plans for transforming the company's culture, improving its financial health, and driving innovation. Some resisted, but the road ahead was still long. Renee knew that true change didn't happen overnight. It would take time, persistence, and a lot of how others rallied behind her. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Employees who had once felt alienated or overlooked started to see the potential for change, for a company that was truly inclusive, where everyone had a voice. And as the culture began to shift, so did the company's performance. Productivity increased, new ideas began to flow more freely, and morale improved. The media, too, began to take notice of the positive changes happening at TechCore. D-work. But she was ready for it. She had taken the first steps, and now it was about continuing to push forward, no matter the obstacles that lay in her path. This wasn't just about leading a company. It was about proving that she belonged in this space, that Black women belonged in these spaces, and she was determined to leave her mark, despite the progress Renee was making within the walls of TechCore. The external world seemed determined to test her at every turn. Becoming a high-profile CEO as a Black woman had placed her under a microscope that magnified not only her successes but also her challenges in ways that white male CEOs rarely experienced. The media, industry insiders, and even members of the public scrutinized her every move with a level of intensity and bias that she couldn't ignore. Almost overnight, Renee had become a symbol, both for those who celebrated her as a trailblazer and for those who saw her rise as a threat to the status quo. The reactions were extreme on both ends. On one side, she was being hailed as a hero for women of color, a living example of what was possible in corporate America if one persevered. But on the other, she was being targeted by a wave of criticism that was often rooted not in her actions as CEO, but in her very identity. The headlines were relentless. Every decision she made seemed to spark debate, and often, the coverage wasn't about her leadership or business strategy. It was about her as a Black woman in power. Some articles suggested that her focus on diversity and inclusion was distracting from TechCore's profitability, questioning whether her leadership style was suited for the tech industry at all. Others didn't even try to disguise their thinly veiled racism and sexism, labeling her as aggressive or too focused on social issues to lead a major corporation. The backlash was fierce and deeply personal, and Renee had expected some resistance, but the extent of the public prejudice still caught her off guard. She had always been aware of how her identity shaped the way others perceived her, but now, as a Black woman leading a major corporation, it felt like every aspect of her was under attack. The double standard was glaring. Male CEOs were allowed to be aggressive, bold, and unapologetic. They were celebrated for taking risks, even when those risks didn't pay off. But Renee was held to a different standard. She had to walk a tightrope, assertive but not too much, confident but not arrogant, successful but without seeming too ambitious. It was exhausting. One of the most jarring experiences came when she received an anonymous letter, mailed directly to her office at TechCore. The letter was brief but cutting, written in scrawled handwriting that made her stomach turn. "You don't belong here. Stop pretending you're something you're not. No one wants a Black woman running things. Go back to where you came from." Renee read the letter twice, her hands shaking with anger. She had faced prejudice before, growing up, in college, throughout her career. But something about this letter felt different. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the intent behind them. This wasn't just about doubting her abilities. This was about erasing her altogether. Whoever had written it didn't see her as a person, much less a capable leader. They saw her as an anomaly, something to be rid of. For a few moments, the familiar feelings of frustration and doubt surfaced again. Was this what it meant to be at the top? To constantly have to defend your right to be there, even when you'd earned it? Was it worth all the scrutiny, all the personal attacks? The public narrative wasn't about her work anymore. It was about whether she even deserved to hold the position she had fought so hard to achieve. Renee crumpled the letter in her hand and threw it in the trash. This wasn't going to stop her. She had faced bigger challenges before, and she wasn't going to let the small-mindedness of a few stop her from achieving her goals. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and reminded herself of the people she was doing this for. Her family, the women who looked up to her, and the employees at TechCore who needed her leadership. But even as she hardened her resolve, she knew that the battle was far from over. The prejudice she faced wasn't just about letters or media bias. It was systemic. It was ingrained in the corporate world, in the very structures that had long excluded people like her. And those structures weren't going to change overnight. One of the most glaring examples of this came from within the tech community itself. Despite her growing reputation as a leader, Renee found herself repeatedly sidelined at industry events and conferences. Invitations that should have come her way were mysteriously rescinded or never arrived at all. Panels discussing the future of tech leadership often featured an array of executives, but conspicuously left Renee off the list. She knew why. People weren't ready for a Black woman to take up space in those circles. At one particularly notable industry summit, where Renee had been invited as a keynote speaker, she experienced a stark reminder of how far there was still to go. She arrived at the event, prepared to deliver a powerful speech on innovation and leadership in the tech industry. only to be greeted by a well-meaning but clueless organizer who led her to the wrong entrance and assumed she was part of the event staff. "Excuse me, miss, could you help us set up the tables in the back?" the woman asked, her voice polite but condescending. Renee paused, her stomach tightening with a familiar sense of disbelief and irritation. She had been in these situations before, situations where her very presence in a space caused confusion because it didn't align with people's preconceived notions. But now, as the CEO of one of the most prominent tech companies in the country, being mistaken for the help hit differently. She forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Actually, I'm the keynote speaker," she said evenly, watching as the woman's face flushed with embarrassment. The organizer stammered an apology, but the damage was done. This was the reality of being a black woman in leadership. No matter how high you climbed, there would always be people who refused to see you for who you were, people who couldn't reconcile your success with their limited worldview. Renee delivered her speech that day with even more passion than she had intended. She talked about the future of tech, the importance of diverse perspectives in driving innovation, and the need for industries to evolve if they wanted to stay relevant in a rapidly changing world. Her words were met with applause, but she knew that for many in the audience, she was still an outlier, someone who didn't fit the mold of what a tech leader was supposed to look like. But it wasn't just about her anymore. Renee wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all the women of color who would come after her. She was fighting to open doors that had been closed for too long, to break down the barriers that had kept people like her out of positions of power. Every time she faced prejudice, whether from anonymous letters, clueless event organizers, or skeptical board members, she reminded herself of the bigger picture. Her success wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. As the weeks went on, the external conflict continued to escalate. There were more articles questioning her leadership, more anonymous messages attacking her for who she was rather than what she had accomplished. But there were also more voices of support, people who saw her for what she truly was, a capable, visionary leader who was determined to transform the tech industry. One particularly touching moment came when a young black woman reached out to her via social media, thanking her for being such a visible and inspiring figure. The message read, "Seeing you at the top makes me believe that I can get there too. You don't know how much that means to someone like me, who's always been told that people who look like us don't belong in these spaces. Thank you for paving the way." Renee read the message over and over, her eyes welling up with emotion. This was why she did it. This was why she endured the prejudice, the criticism, and the public scrutiny. It wasn't just about her success. It was about creating opportunities for others, about showing the next generation that they could reach heights that had once seemed impossible. Still, the challenges persisted. Renee knew that the external conflict wouldn't end with a few supportive messages or positive media stories. The prejudice was systemic, and it would take time to dismantle. But for every step forward, every victory, however small, she knew she was making progress. And she wasn't fighting alone. She had the support of her family, her team, and a growing community of people who believed in her mission. Renee resolved to keep pushing, to keep proving herself, not because she needed validation, but because she knew the fight for equality and representation was far from over. She was determined to make sure that the next black woman who became a CEO wouldn't have to face the same level of scrutiny and prejudice that she did. She was going to leave a legacy of change, no matter how difficult the journey was. Renee Jackson was no stranger to challenges, but the sheer magnitude of what she was facing as CEO of Icon Tech Core often felt overwhelming. From internal resistance to external prejudice, the obstacles seemed endless. Yet amidst the chaos, Renee found herself becoming stronger, more determined to rise above the conflicts and push forward. She wasn't just trying to survive, she was determined to thrive. The company had been in a downward spiral when she took over, plagued by scandal and a toxic culture that had driven away talent and tarnished its reputation. But slowly, Renee's leadership was beginning to turn things around. While the media continued to focus on her as a symbol, those within TechCore were beginning to see real change. Internally, she had set in motion a series of structural changes designed to create a more inclusive, innovative, and productive workplace. Her first priority was rebuilding trust. The trust between the employees and leadership had been shattered by years of poor management, favoritism, and toxic practices. Renee knew that if she wanted to lead this company to success, she had to first restore the faith of her team. She began by holding regular town hall meetings with employees across all levels of the company. These meetings were different from the corporate, top-down sessions that had been the norm under the previous CEO. Instead of scripted speeches and rehearsed answers, Renee encouraged open dialogue. Employees were invited to voice their concerns, ask questions, and offer suggestions, and most importantly, they were encouraged to speak the truth, without fear of retaliation. At first, there was hesitation. Years of mismanagement had left many employees skeptical that any real change was possible. They had heard promises before, only to see nothing come of them, but Renee's sincerity began to break through that wall of cynicism. She wasn't just another CEO making empty promises, she was genuinely listening. During one of the first town hall meetings, a young engineer named David, who had been with the company for nearly a decade, stood up. He looked nervous as he cleared his throat and glanced around the room, but there was a fire in his eyes that Renee recognized immediately. "I've been here for a long time," David began, "and I've seen a lot of things that aren't right. We've lost good people, smart, talented people, because they didn't feel valued or heard. It's been hard to watch." He paused, and for a moment the room was silent. "What I want to know is, how do we know this time is going to be different?" David's voice cracked slightly, and Renee could hear the frustration behind his words. "How do we know that you're not just another CEO making promises that won't lead anywhere?" The question hung in the air, and all eyes turned to Renee. This was a pivotal moment, one of many she would face as she continued to rebuild the company. She had a choice. She could give a rehearsed corporate response, or she could speak from the heart. She chose the latter. "You're right to ask that question," Renee said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know that trust isn't something you give easily, especially after everything that's happened. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you that things will change overnight. Real change takes time. But I can promise you this. I'm not here to keep things the same. I'm here to make this a company where people feel valued, where your voices are heard, and where everyone has the opportunity to succeed." She paused, looking directly at David, then at the rest of the room. "You have my word that I will do everything in my power to make that happen, but I can't do it alone. I need your help. I need your voices. Together, we can make this company better than it's ever been." David nodded slowly, his expression softening. He wasn't fully convinced. Trust takes time. But it was a start. Renee knew that moments like this would be key in rebuilding the foundation of TechCore. It wasn't just about policies and strategies. It was about people, about creating a culture where employees felt seen and heard. As the weeks passed, the changes Renee implemented began to take root. She introduced leadership training programs designed to address the toxic behaviors that had plagued the company for years. Managers who had previously relied on fear and intimidation were now being taught the importance of empathy, communication, and mentorship. Those who resisted the change were gradually replaced, either leaving on their own or being moved to other roles where they could no longer undermine the company's new direction. But the changes weren't limited to leadership. Renee understood that innovation came from diversity, not just in terms of race or gender, but in perspectives and ideas. She implemented a more inclusive hiring process, reaching out to underrepresented communities and schools, ensuring that the next generation of TechCore employees would reflect the world they lived in. One of the most significant changes came when Renee revamped the company's internal communication system. Under the previous regime, information had flowed only one way, from the top down. Employees were often kept in the dark about important decisions, leaving them feeling disconnected and undervalued. Renee flipped that model on its head. She created open channels of communication, where employees at all levels could contribute ideas, provide feedback, and even propose new projects. The results were immediate. Within weeks, TechCore saw a spike in productivity and creativity. Employees who had once felt stifled and overlooked were now taking ownership of their work, coming up with innovative solutions, and collaborating across departments. The new system fostered a sense of community and empowerment that had been missing for far too long. Externally, the company's reputation also began to recover. Slowly but surely, TechCore started regaining the trust of its partners and investors. The media, which had once been so quick to criticize Renee's leadership, began to take notice of the positive changes happening under her watch. Articles appeared praising her bold moves to transform the company's culture and her focus on inclusivity as a driver of innovation. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from within the company itself. Employees were beginning to believe again. Renee had always known that the key to turning TechCore around wasn't just in improving the bottom line. It was in creating a workplace where people felt motivated, inspired, and valued. And now, for the first time in years, that was happening. There was still much work to be done, but the tide had begun to turn. Renee could see it in the way people interacted with each other, in the way ideas flowed freely during meetings, and in the way employees spoke about the company with pride again. However, even as she began to see these positive changes, Renee knew that her journey to fully transform TechCore was far from over. She had won some battles, but the war for the company's future was still being waged. One of the hardest parts about being in a position of power was realizing that not everyone would appreciate or understand the changes she was trying to make. The higher she climbed, the more isolated she felt. Even though she had the support of many employees and allies, there were still those in the upper echelons of the industry who doubted her. The old guard, entrenched in their ways, wasn't ready to let go of their hold on power. A prime example of this came when a powerful board member, Frank Mitchell, requested a private meeting with Renee. Frank had been a part of TechCore since its inception and had wielded significant influence within the company for years. He was one of the few remaining vestiges of the old regime, and while he had publicly supported Renee's appointment as CEO, she knew that behind the scenes, he had been one of her biggest critics. The meeting was tense from the moment she walked into his office. Frank wasted no time getting to the point. "Renee," he began, his tone calm but authoritative. "I've been hearing a lot of good things about the changes you've made, but I want to remind you that this company's success has always been built on its bottom line. We can't afford to get distracted." Renee raised an eyebrow, already anticipating where this conversation was going. "Distracted?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Frank leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on his desk. "You've been pushing this diversity and inclusion agenda pretty hard, and while I understand its importance, we have to be careful. The board needs to see results, financial results, or they're going to start asking questions." There it was, the underlying message that so many had been trying to push on her since she took over. That diversity was a distraction from profitability. Renee had heard this argument time and time again, and it always infuriated her. It was as if people like Frank couldn't comprehend that diversity and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. In fact, they were directly linked. Renee took a deep breath before responding. "Frank, I appreciate your concerns, but I want to be clear. Diversity and inclusion aren't distractions. They're the future of this company. When people feel valued, when they bring different perspectives to the table, that's when we'll see real innovation. And innovation is what's going to drive our financial success. Frank's expression didn't change, but she could see the flicker of frustration in his eyes. He didn't get it. But Renee didn't need his approval. She wasn't asking for permission to lead the company her way. She was already doing it. The meeting ended on a polite but strained note. As she left Frank's office, Renee felt a surge of resolve. This was the fight she had signed up for. She knew there would always be people like Frank, people who clung to the old ways, who couldn't see the value in changing the status quo. But she wasn't going to let them stop her. Renee had started this journey with a vision to create a company where everyone had a voice, where innovation thrived, and where diversity was a strength, not a liability. And she wasn't going to stop until that vision was fully realized. The road to recovery was long, but with every step, Renee was building a stronger, more resilient company, and a stronger, more resilient self. While Renee had been focused on rebuilding TechCore and establishing her place in the corporate world, there was another part of her life that had quietly but powerfully shaped the leader she had become: her family. Throughout the ups and downs of her career, her family's presence had been a constant source of strength and inspiration. They had been her foundation, her reminder of what really mattered. Renee's journey to success was deeply intertwined with the lessons she had learned from her family, particularly her mother. Growing up in a modest home in Chicago, she had watched her mother, Renee Jackson, work tirelessly to raise her and her siblings. Linda had been the embodiment of resilience, a single mother who had juggled multiple jobs to ensure that her children had every opportunity to succeed. Despite the hardships they faced, Linda had always made it clear that education and self-belief were the keys to overcoming the systemic obstacles the world had placed in their way. "You can be anything you want to be," Linda used to tell Renee when she was just a child, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Those words had stayed with Renee throughout her life, becoming a mantra she repeated to herself in times of doubt and adversity. And now, as she stood at the pinnacle of her career, she often reflected on how much of her success was rooted in the sacrifices her mother had made. She had been taught from a young age to fight for what she wanted, even when the odds were stacked against her, and that lesson had carried her through the toughest moments of her journey. But there was more to it than just the drive to succeed. Renee had learned the importance of community and giving back from her mother as well. Linda had always emphasized that their success wasn't just for themselves, it was for those who came after them. She had been deeply involved in their local community, organizing events, mentoring young people, and making sure that the next generation had the support they needed to succeed. It was that same spirit of giving back that had driven Renee to mentor other young women, particularly women of color, throughout her career. She had always believed that her success meant little if she couldn't use it to help others achieve their own. This belief had become a cornerstone of her leadership style. And now, as CEO of TechCore, she had the opportunity to make that vision a reality on a much larger scale. Renee's mother had passed away a few years before she became CEO, but her influence was still felt in everything Renee did. Linda's legacy lived on in her daughter's determination, resilience, and unwavering commitment to creating opportunities for others. It was a legacy of love, sacrifice, and strength, one that Renee was determined to honor in her work. In addition to her mother's influence, Renee's bond with her siblings had also played a crucial role in shaping her perspective on leadership and success. Growing up, she had been the eldest of three, and as such, she had always felt a sense of responsibility to set a good example for her younger brother and sister, Darius and Alicia. Their family had been close-knit, bound together by shared experiences and a deep understanding of what it meant to face the world as a Black family in America. Darius, now a civil rights attorney, had always admired his sister's ambition and tenacity. "You're doing this for all of us," he had told her when she had first become CEO, his voice filled with pride. "You're showing the world what's possible for people like us." Alicia, on the other hand, had followed in their mother's footsteps and become a community organizer, working tirelessly to improve conditions in their old neighborhood. She had always been the one to remind Renee of the importance of staying connected to their roots, of using their success to uplift those who had been left behind. As Renee navigated the challenges of leading TechCore, she often thought about her family and the example they had set for her. They had shown her that success wasn't just about personal achievement, it was about building a legacy that could inspire and empower others. That was the true meaning of leadership. And it was a lesson she carried with her into every decision she made as CEO. But beyond her immediate family, Renee had also built a new kind of family at TechCore. As she had begun to rebuild the company's culture, she had created an environment where people from all walks of life could feel like they belonged. Her leadership had turned the company into a place where diversity was celebrated, not just tolerated. A place where employees felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. The company's new mentorship program, which Renee had championed from the start, was one of her proudest achievements. Through this program, young employees from underrepresented backgrounds were paired with senior executives, giving them the guidance and support they needed to advance in their careers. The program wasn't just about professional development. It was about creating a sense of community and belonging within the company. Renee often met with these young employees, listening to their stories and offering advice, just as her mother had done for so many in their community. She wanted to make sure that they felt seen and valued, that they understood their potential to achieve great things. It was during these meetings that she saw the future of TechCore and the future of corporate America. These young professionals, with their diverse backgrounds and fresh perspectives, were the key to driving innovation and growth in the years to come. But the mentorship program was just one part of Renee's larger vision for the company. She wanted to create a lasting legacy, one that would ensure that TechCore remained a leader in both innovation and inclusion long after her tenure as CEO ended. To do that, she knew she had to lay the groundwork for long-term cultural change. In partnership with her leadership team, Renee established the TechCore Leadership Academy, an initiative designed to train the next generation of leaders within the company. The academy focused not only on developing business acumen and technical skills, but also on fostering emotional intelligence, cultural awareness, and inclusive leadership. Renee understood that the leaders of tomorrow needed more than just the ability to run a profitable business. They needed to know how to lead with empathy, integrity, and vision. The impact of these initiatives was already being felt throughout the company. Employees who had once felt disconnected from the company's mission were now re-engaged, contributing new ideas and collaborating across departments. Productivity was up, and TechCore's public image had begun to recover, thanks in large part to the positive stories coming out of the company about its renewed focus on inclusion and innovation. But for Renee, the greatest reward wasn't the public recognition or the improved financial performance. It was the knowledge that she was leaving behind a company that would continue to thrive and grow long after she had moved on. Her legacy at TechCore would be one of transformation, not just in terms of business success, but in terms of culture, leadership, and community. As she reflected on her journey, Renee couldn't help but think about her mother, who had always believed in her even when the world didn't. Linda Jackson had laid the foundation for her daughter's success, and now Renee was doing the same for others. Renee was deep in her office at TechCore one late afternoon, catching up on emails and reviewing the latest company reports. It had been another long day, but there was a sense of fulfillment that came with each new milestone the company achieved. TechCore was on the road to recovery, and its culture was being reshaped by her leadership. It had been a tough journey, but seeing the results of her hard work made it all worthwhile. As she was going over the final numbers for the quarter, Renee received an unexpected message from her assistant, Maria. "Renee, there's something happening downstairs in the lobby. The board wants you to come down immediately." Renee frowned slightly. There hadn't been any meetings scheduled with the board for that afternoon. Nevertheless, she set her work aside and made her way to the lobby, curiosity and a hint of concern swirling in her mind. As she approached the lobby, she could hear the faint hum of voices. When the elevator doors slid open, she was greeted by a sight that took her breath away. The entire TechCore staff had gathered in the lobby, smiling and clapping as she stepped out of the elevator. Banners were strung up across the walls, and a large sign at the center of the room read, "Thank you, Renee." For a moment, Renee stood there, stunned and speechless. She had been so focused on the work, on the challenges and the resistance, that she hadn't realized just how much of an impact she had made on the people around her. This wasn't about corporate achievements or financial gains. This was about the community she had built, the people she had inspired. The board of directors was there as well, standing at the front of the crowd. David, the young engineer who had once questioned whether real change was possible, stood next to them holding a plaque. He stepped forward, his eyes shining with gratitude. "Renee," he began, his voice clear and steady, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say that you've changed this company in ways we never thought possible. You've shown us what real leadership looks like, and you've created a culture where all of us feel like we belong. We owe so much of our success to you." David held out the plaque, and Renee stepped forward to accept it. As she took it in her hands, she saw the inscription, "In recognition of your vision, leadership, and commitment to building a better future for us all." The crowd erupted into applause, and for the first time in a long time, Renee felt the full weight of what she had accomplished. This moment wasn't just a celebration of her achievements. It was a recognition of the journey she had taken, the barriers she had broken, and the lives she had touched along the way. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked out over the crowd. This was the true measure of her success. Not the headlines, not the profits, but the people who had stood by her, who had believed in her, and who had grown under her leadership. This was her legacy. Later that evening, after the celebration had ended and the office had quieted down, Renee sat alone in her office, reflecting on everything that had led her to this moment. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with challenges she had never anticipated. But through it all, she had stayed true to herself, to her vision, and to the values her mother had instilled in her. As she looked at the plaque on her desk, Renee thought about how far she had come, from the girl scribbling business plans in her notebook to the CEO of one of the most influential tech companies in the world. She had faced rejection, prejudice, and doubt at every step of the way, but she had never let it break her. Instead, she had used it to fuel her ambition, to push herself to achieve more, and to create opportunities for others. But more than anything, Renee thought about the legacy she was leaving behind. It wasn't just about what she had accomplished for herself, it was about what she had built for the future. TechCore was no longer just a company. It was a community, a place where people from all backgrounds could thrive. And that, more than anything, was what she was proud of. Renee's phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from her brother. "Darius. Proud of you, sis. Mom would be too. Keep shining." Renee smiled, her heart full. Her family had always been her greatest source of strength, and their love had carried her through the darkest times. They had believed in her when the world didn't, and now she was determined to carry that belief forward, to be the kind of leader her mother had always known she could be. As she closed her laptop and prepared to head home for the evening, Renee took one last look at the skyline outside her window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of how much possibility the world still held. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where she would continue to lead with purpose, vision, and heart. Her legacy would live on in the people she had touched, the barriers she had broken, and the future she had helped create. And as she walked out of the office that night, Renee Jackson knew one thing for certain. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Renee Jackson's journey didn't end with becoming CEO. It was just the beginning. From the rejection that almost broke her to the heights of corporate leadership, Renee transformed not just a company, but an entire narrative about what's possible for women of color in leadership. Her legacy isn't just in the profits she restored or the culture she rebuilt at TechCore. It's in the countless lives she's touched, the barriers she's broken, and the future she's paved for those who come after her. Renee's story is a reminder to us all. When the world says you don't belong, prove that you do, and build something even greater. Because real leadership is about more than holding power. It's about changing the game for everyone.